Montana Territory, 1883. The wind carried dust down the main street of Dry Creek as the stagecoach doors swung open, and out stepped a woman in a dress so worn and thin, it barely held together at the seams. Her name was Beatrice Fuller, and every eye in town landed on her like she had dropped from the sky. Her boots were scuffed raw, her bonnet drooped like it had been trampled, and her eyes, blue, wide, tired, swept over the unfamiliar town with a quiet kind of dread. A boy on the boardwalk laughed. "She looks like a scarecrow that wandered off a field." Laughter followed. Even the station master, a man with tobacco stains on his teeth, gave her a look that stung. Beatrice didn't flinch. She stood straight, spine stiff with pride, though her fingers trembled slightly where they clutched a worn carpetbag. There was nothing left in it but a letter promising marriage, a promise that had died weeks ago when the man who wrote it was killed in a saloon brawl in Kansas before she ever left Missouri. She was supposed to be a bride by now. Instead, she was alone, mocked, and wearing the only thing she owned. She took a step off the platform and nearly stumbled into the dust. A voice, deep and steady, cut through the murmurs. "That's enough." The crowd quieted some. Beatrice turned her head and saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, a man in his early 30s with sun-dark skin and a shadow of beard. His hat was pulled low, and his gray eyes flicked over the gathering crowd before settling on her. He stepped forward, boots thudding against the dirt, and offered his hand. "Name's Archer Vaughn." She stared at the hand, then up at him. "Beatrice Fuller." He tipped his hat. "You got folks here," she blinked, swallowed. "No, then you do now," gasps rippled, whispers, the widow Cowboy taking in a stranger in rags, but Archer ignored every voice but hers. "I have nothing," she said softly. "Not money, not family. Not even a proper dress. You have a name," he said, "and you've got a place if you want it." Beatrice's chin lifted, pride tugging at her heart. "Why?" He met her eyes with quiet steadiness. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything." She didn't know what made her take his hand. Maybe it was the way his voice didn't rush her. Or maybe it was the way he didn't look at her clothes, or the dirt, or the tears that burned behind her eyes. He just looked at her. Archer led her past the gawkers and toward his wagon. She climbed up beside him, her bag on her lap, heart pounding. The ride out of town was silent, save for the creak of the wagon wheels and the wind over the plains. The land stretched wide, gold and brown and wild. She glanced at him, saw the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw stayed tight. "How long have you been alone?" she asked. He didn't look at her. "My wife died 4 years ago. Fever took her quick." She didn't press. He didn't speak more. But that silence, it felt safe. By the time they reached his ranch, dusk had fallen. The house was modest wooden, with a small porch and smoke curling from the chimney. 2 children burst from the front door at the sound of the wagon. "Papa!" A girl of about 8 flung herself into Archer's arms. A boy, a year or 2 older, stood back, watching Beatrice with guarded eyes. "This is Elsie," Archer said, setting the girl down. "And that's Ellie." Beatrice's heart caught. "You didn't say, thought you should see for yourself." He looked at her then, face unreadable. "They need someone kind, someone strong." "I do not know anything about raising children," she whispered. "Just be honest with them," he said. "That's more than most ever give." She nodded, unsure why her eyes prickled with tears. That night, Archer gave her the room that had once belonged to his wife. It was small, clean, with a quilt on the bed and a window facing the pasture. Beatrice stood in the doorway, heart pounding. She turned to him. "Why are you really doing this?" Archer rubbed the back of his neck. "Because I saw how they looked at you, and because I know what it's like to be left behind." She stepped inside the room, touched the quilt gently. "I can try to help, around the house. With the children." "That's all I ask," he said, and left her there with the door open. In the weeks that followed, Beatrice worked from dawn to dusk. She chopped vegetables with Elsie, mended Ellie's shirts, hauled water, scrubbed floors. Her hands blistered, her back ached, but every evening she sat at the dinner table across from Archer Vaughn, and every night she fell asleep listening to the quiet hum of a home that was slowly, day by day, becoming hers. The townsfolk still whispered when she came to town, but they did not laugh anymore. One morning, as winter edged closer and the air grew sharp, Beatrice was hanging laundry when Archer walked up behind her. "You might want to come see the barn," she frowned. "Why?" He didn't answer. Just led her there. Inside, a small table stood in the center. On it, a new pair of boots, a wool coat, a dress simple, sturdy, clean. Beatrice stared. "What is this?" Archer cleared his throat. "Thought maybe you deserved to be seen the way you are now." "Not the way you were." Her hands trembled as she touched the fabric. "You did not have to." "I wanted to." She turned to him. His eyes were steady again, but warmer now. "I never expected kindness from a stranger." "You are not a stranger anymore," he said, and something shifted. That night, when the children were asleep, Beatrice stepped onto the porch. Archer was there, staring out at the stars. "I do not know if I am what you need," she said, voice low. His gaze didn't move from the sky. "I think you are exactly what I need." She stepped closer. "I came here with nothing but a broken promise." He turned to her. "Then let me make you a new one." Beatrice raised her eyes to his. "What kind?" Archer's voice was quiet, certain. "One I intend to keep." And when he reached out to take her hand, she did not hesitate. The first snow came early that year, drifting soft and silent over the plains, laying a pale hush across everything. Beatrice stood at the kitchen window, sleeves rolled to the elbows, watching the flakes gather on the fence rails. The stove crackled behind her, a pot of beans simmering low. Archer had taken Ellie out to check the creek line, and Elsie sat at the table stringing cranberries for the hearth. "I think the red makes it prettier," the girl said, tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth as she threaded another berry. Beatrice offered a quiet smile. "It does." "You've a good eye." Elsie looked up. "You talk different from folks here." "I was raised near the Missouri River. My father came from Boston, my mother from a farm outside Lexington. Guess some of their words stuck to me." Elsie considered that. "Papa says you read books." "I do." "Will you teach me?" The girl's voice was hopeful but shy. Beatrice nodded. "Of course." Later that week, she cleared a space on the kitchen shelf and arranged a small row of worn spines. A Bible, a primer, and 2 novels Archer had found in a trunk in the loft. Each evening, after supper, she and Elsie sat with the primer between them, candles flickering low while Ellie carved figures from scrap wood nearby. One night, Archer lingered in the doorway watching them. His coat was dusted with snow, and his eyes held something quieter than usual. "You're building something here," he said once the children were asleep and the fire burned low. Beatrice folded the quilt in her lap. "So are you." He stepped closer. "I've been thinking about the land west of the ridge. There's a spring there and enough space for a few milk cows. Might be time to build a second shelter, something smaller at first but solid." She studied him. "Why now?" Archer looked down at the floorboards. "Because I see the way you fit into this place. Not by force, not by duty, just natural." Beatrice's voice was soft. "You don't have to build something for me, Archer." He looked up. "I want to, that's the difference." After a long pause, she reached out and touched his sleeve. "Tell me about your mother," he blinked. "Why?" "Because I want to know the people who shaped you." He sat then, pulling off his gloves. She was from Tennessee, tough as rawhide, but she could sing like a meadowlark, used to hum while she stitched. "After Pa died, she ran the ranch alone until I was old enough to help." "That's where you learned all this," Beatrice said, motioning toward the walls, the hearth, the quiet order of the home. "Some of it, maybe. The rest I learned the hard way." She nodded. "Hard lessons stay longer." He met her eyes. "You carry a few yourself." She didn't look away. "I do." The next morning, Ellie asked Beatrice to ride out with him and Archer. She hesitated. The snow had thickened overnight, and she hadn't been on a horse since leaving Missouri. But Ellie was watching her with something close to a challenge in his eyes, and she sensed it mattered. Archer saddled the gentlest mare they owned, and she mounted with stiff knees, fingers white against the reins. The wind cut sharp across the pasture, but she kept her spine straight, her gaze steady. They rode past the old cottonwoods to where the creek curved around a bend. Archer dismounted and crouched near the edge. "Beavers have been at it again," he said, pointing to the dammed water. Ellie turned to Beatrice. "Think we should trap them," she considered. "If they're flooding the fence line, yes. But if they're not causing harm, let them be. They're just trying to live." Archer glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "That's a fair way to see it." That night, she found a sprig of pine tucked beside her plate at supper. No one mentioned it, but when she glanced across the table, Archer's eyes met hers. She held the gaze a moment longer than usual. Days passed. The snow deepened. Beatrice began sewing new curtains from flour sacks, and Elsie took to helping without being asked. Ellie warmed faster than she'd expected. He started asking her opinions on things: how to patch a saddle strap, whether he ought to mend his work shirt or toss it. She gave him honest answers, and he seemed to respect that. One evening, after the chores were done and the children had gone to bed, Archer came in from the barn and poured hot water into the basin. "You've done more than I ever expected," he said. Beatrice dried her hands on a cloth. "I only gave what I had, and what you had was enough." He stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough she could feel the heat rising off his coat. "I'd like to make it official, Beatrice. Not for show, not for convenience, but for what's growing between us." Her breath caught. "You're asking me," he nodded. "Not out of obligation, but because this house feels different with you in it, and I'd like to wake each morning knowing you'll still be here." She looked down at her hands. They were rough now, strong from weeks of work, but steadier than they'd ever been. "I came with nothing. You came with courage." Her voice wavered just slightly. "Yes." He reached for her hand then, and this time she didn't need to think. She laced her fingers with his, and the silence that followed was full, not empty. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, but inside the house, it was quiet and warm. The wedding took place in the Vaughn pasture, where the grass still peeked through the thinning snow and the cottonwoods stood like quiet witnesses. Archer built a small arch of cedar and pine boughs, and Ellie tied red ribbons from Elsie's sewing basket through the branches. There were no guests beyond the children and Reverend Markham, who rode out from Dry Creek in his Sunday coat, boots mudded from the trail. Beatrice wore the wool dress Archer had given her. She'd altered the hem with a scrap of lace from a feed sack and stitched a row of small buttons down the back with thread almost too fine to see. Her hands didn't tremble as she fastened them. Her eyes didn't stray as she walked barefoot across the frozen ground. It was quiet, and it was enough. After the vows, Elsie reached up and pressed a daisy into Beatrice's palm. The girl had found it under the eaves, half frozen but still blooming. Beatrice didn't say anything, just tucked it into her hair and knelt to kiss her daughter's brow. Later, after Reverend Markham had ridden off and the sun lowered behind the ridge, Archer brought out a tin of preserved peaches he'd put aside last summer. They ate by the hearth, the four of them, passing the tin around and dipping spoons like it was gold. Archer leaned back in his chair, watching the children doze beneath the quilt on the floor. "You ever think about naming land?" Beatrice glanced over. "What would you name this?" He folded his hands behind his head. "Haven, maybe, or Quiet Bend." She considered that. "Quiet suits you." He gave a low laugh. "You'd know better than most." The night deepened. When the fire burned low, Archer unlatched the door to what had been his room and now was theirs. The room had changed. Beatrice had replaced the heavy curtains with muslin, let in more light. A carved box sat on the shelf beside the bed, filled with spools and folded cloth. Her touch was in the corners now, but it hadn't erased what came before. It settled beside it. He turned to her, voice low. "You don't have to rush." She stepped past him, brushed her hand along the edge of the quilt. "I know." They undressed in silence, no grand gestures, no declarations. Just the slow gathering of trust, his calloused fingers at the buttons of her dress, her hand at the collar of his shirt. They moved like people who had been broken once and were learning again. After, she lay with her cheek against his shoulder, listening to the wind press against the windows. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she whispered. Archer didn't speak. He just drew her closer, thumb brushing the inside of her wrist like he was memorizing the shape of her. The days shortened. Snow came heavier, covering the roof in thick white sheets. Archer and Elise spent their mornings breaking ice in the watering troughs, while Beatrice taught Elsie her letters by the stove. At night, they read aloud from the primer, each word a small victory. One afternoon, Beatrice rode out alone for the first time. She took the mare along the south fence, checking for breaks. The air bit at her cheeks, but the motion steadied her. When she returned, Archer met her at the gate, a hint of concern in his brow. "You didn't say where you were headed." "I needed to feel capable," she said. "Not just tucked safe indoors," he nodded once. "You are." That evening, he brought her a length of fence wire and pliers. "If you're riding out, you might as well mend what needs mending," she smiled. "You trust me with that, more than I trust most men I've known." By the time February came, the pantry shelves had thinned, flour was low, and the last of the root vegetables had gone soft. Beatrice folded the ledger closed and looked over at Archer, who was sharpening a blade by the stove. "If I ride into town tomorrow, I can trade the wool scraps for lard and salt." He paused. "You sure you want to do that alone? I'm not afraid of them anymore." He set the blade down. "Then take the wagon, Endely. He's old enough to keep watch." The ride into Dry Creek was quiet. Illy sat beside her, watching the road with the same stillness his father carried. When they reached the general store, Beatrice stepped down first, the hem of her skirt catching the snow. The clerk behind the counter blinked when she walked in. "Mrs. Vaughn." She met his eye without flinching. "I've wool remnants to trade." He cleared his throat. "Right, let's see what you've got." She laid the bundles on the counter. The man examined them silently, then weighed out the salt and lard, no haggling. When she stepped back outside, Illy held the reins steady, eyes scanning the street. "You all right, Ma?" She smiled at the word. "Yes, let's go home." That night, Archer added a second log to the fire and poured hot cider into 2 tin cups. "Illy told me you held your ground. I didn't give them the chance not to see me." He nodded slowly. "You've changed the shape of this place." Beatrice traced the rim of her cup. "And you've given me the space to grow." He reached across the space between them, fingers curling around hers. "We're not just surviving anymore." "No," she said, eyes steady on his. "We're living." And beneath the sound of the wind outside, there was warmth in the silence again, earned, whole, and lasting. March came restless and wet, dragging mud through the yard and soaking the pasture until it swallowed boots to the ankle. The thaw brought more than melting snow. It loosened the ground beneath the Vaughn homestead, softened the edges of old grief, and stirred up things that had long settled quiet. Beatrice stood at the barn's open doors, sleeves rolled to her elbows, sleeves she'd let down only once the last light faded. She watched Archer wrestle a new foal from its mother's side, steady hands guiding the slick colt into the hay. His shirt clung to his back, damp from effort, his jaw drawn tight with focus. "That one'll be headstrong," she said when he straightened. Archer wiped his hands on a cloth, glancing at her sidelong. "Takes after the woman watching him then." Beatrice leaned against the frame. "He's got good legs." "Might carry weight before autumn. He'll need breaking first." She stepped into the stall, trailing fingers along the colt's damp flank. "I'd like to help train him." Archer studied her. "You ever broken a horse?" "No," she said, "but I've known how to hold my ground for most of my life." "That counts for something." The next morning, she was up before the rooster, waiting with the halter in hand. She didn't ask permission again. By late spring, the colt had taken to her voice. Let her tie him, brush him, walk him slow around the yard. He still flinched at storms, still kicked the stall door when the wind howled, but Beatrice didn't flinch in return. She stood her ground and the colt learned. Archer watched from the fence line, arms crossed, a quiet pride in his eyes that he didn't speak of. One evening, after supper, Beatrice sat with Illy on the porch, mending the sleeve of his work shirt. He watched her needle move with care. "Why do you always stitch the inside first?" he asked. "It holds better," she said. "What's on the outside matters less than what keeps it together underneath." He nodded, thoughtful. "Pa said the same thing about fences." She smiled faintly. "He's right." "Do you think you'll stay forever?" he asked suddenly, eyes not meeting hers. She set the shirt aside. "If your father'll have me, I'll be here until I'm old and gray." Illy nodded again, then rose and went inside without another word. She didn't follow. Some answers needed time to settle. Later that night, Archer drew her into the kitchen where the lamplight flickered low. He held a folded piece of paper in one hand. "Letter came today," he said. "From my sister in Helena. She's asking for help." Beatrice took it, eyes scanning the careful script. She lost her husband, fell from scaffolding, left her with 2 boys and a debt-heavy farm. She's too proud to say it outright, but she needs someone she trusts. She folded the letter, setting it on the table. "You'll go." "I was thinking we both would, not to leave here, just to help her through the season. She always looked after me when I was small." Beatrice looked out the window where the barn lantern flickered. "We can take Elsie and Illy, show them the mountains." He stepped behind her, laid his palm against her waist. "You're willing," she turned to face him. "Your family's mine now. And your burdens, too." The next week was spent in preparation. Beatrice packed carefully 2 dresses, a shawl, Archer's ledger, and the primer. Elsie carried the daisy Beatrice had dried between pages, now pressed flat and brown. Ellie sharpened every tool twice, nervously precise. They left at dawn, the wagon creaking under the weight of supplies. The journey took 4 days. The roads were rutted and slow, but they made camp each night with dry firewood and simple meals. On the second night, Beatrice woke to find Archer sitting with his boots off, staring into the embers. "What is it?" she asked, settling beside him. "Just remembering," he said. "She helped raise me after Ma passed, cooked with her elbows deep in flour and never let me slack on chores. I owe her more than I've given." Beatrice laid her head against his shoulder. "You'll give her what she needs now." They reached the farm on a gray morning. The house was sagging at the porch, but smoke curled from the chimney and 2 boys stood at the gate with wary eyes. Archer's sister, Miriam, met them on the steps. She was broader than Beatrice, with wind-burnt cheeks and a voice that cracked when she said her brother's name. Inside, the house was clean but threadbare. Beatrice unpacked without waiting for direction. She scrubbed the floor, then started a stew. Elsie played with the younger boys in the yard, while he helped Archer lift fallen beams from the chicken coop. That night, Archer and Miriam spoke by the hearth while Beatrice stitched a torn curtain in the corner. She didn't interrupt. She only listened as they shared stories, grief, and regrets. When Miriam finally went to bed, Archer joined Beatrice at the window. "You've been quiet," he said. "This place feels heavy," he nodded. "It is. How long will we stay? Until she can stand up straight again." Beatrice pressed her hand to the glass. "Then I'll help her stand." The days stretched into weeks. Beatrice taught Miriam's sons how to tend the stove without burning the bread. She patched their trousers, showed them how to sweep ash without stirring soot into the air. Miriam, slower to trust, watched in silence but said nothing when Beatrice took her place at the washtub or corrected her youngest's uneven seams. One afternoon, Miriam stepped out while Beatrice was shelling peas on the stoop. "I see why he chose you," she said flatly. Beatrice looked up. "I didn't ask to be chosen." "No," Miriam said, folding her arms, "but you stayed. That's more than most." Beatrice returned to her work. "I don't give up what's worth keeping." Miriam lingered a moment longer before stepping back inside. By June, the farm stood straighter. The boys smiled more. Miriam's laugh returned, rough but real, echoing faintly through the kitchen. When Archer said it was time to head home, she didn't ask him to stay. She only pressed a jar of wild plum preserves into Beatrice's hands and nodded once. The road back was dry, the wagon lighter. Illy dozed with his hat tipped over his eyes. Elsie sang to herself, soft and tuneless. Archer took Beatrice's hand on the reins. "You did more than I ever asked." She looked at him, sun warm on her face. "So did you, the day you met me." He kissed the back of her hand, then let it rest in his. The road curved, the mountains behind them, the plains ahead. Home waited, and they rode toward it together. They reached home just before the wheatgrass broke green again across the hills, and the soil gave off the damp, living smell of early summer. Beatrice stepped down from the wagon first, her skirt catching on the wheel rim, and paused to press her palm to the porch rail. It was warm beneath her hand, sun-soaked and splintered in the same familiar places. The house hadn't changed, but it felt more rooted now, as if her leaving and returning had marked it. Inside, Elsie ran ahead, tugging open the cupboard doors, checking the corners, as though making sure the house had waited for them. Illy carried the bundle of tools Archer had lent Miriam's boys, placing them exactly where they'd been before. Beatrice unpacked slowly, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the home. She folded the pressed daisy into a new ledger Archer had brought back from Helena, its crisp pages ready for planting records and household accounts. The old primer, softened now by months of use, found a place on the shelf beside the Bible. That night, when the children had gone to bed and the wind hummed low through the cottonwoods, Archer and Beatrice sat on the porch steps without speaking. The quiet between them had grown easy, like water following a known path. "Illy's taller," Archer said, after a long stretch of silence. "He outgrew his boots last month. I stitched new soles, but they won't last the summer. I'll ride into Miles City next week. They've got a cobbler worth the dust." Beatrice nodded, then looked toward the barn where the colt she'd halter broke stood silhouetted in the moonlight, taller now, calmer. "You think he'll run well?" she asked. "He'll be ready by late autumn. Might even carry fence posts come spring." She leaned into his side, her shoulder to his. "I'd like to name him." Archer didn't hesitate. "That's yours to do." She was quiet a moment longer. "Call him Patience." The next days passed with a new kind of steadiness, not just survival, but shared tending. Archer cleaned the flues before the heat grew sharp. Beatrice soaked the wool she'd carried back from Helena and dyed it with wild onion skins, the color rich and golden. Elsie learned to hem without puckering the fabric, while Ellie took to carving handles for the kitchen drawers, shaping them with care. One morning, Beatrice found Archer mending a wagon wheel just beyond the shed. His sleeves were pushed high, and there was a streak of grease along his jaw. "Did you ever think," she asked, leaning against the doorframe, "that you'd have all this again?" He stood and set the mallet aside. "Not after Eliza passed. I figured I'd raised enough dust for one lifetime." Beatrice stepped forward, brushing the grease from his cheek with the corner of her apron. "You haven't just raised dust, you've built shelter." He caught her wrist gently. "You're the one who turned it into home." Their lips met there, under the wide sky, quiet and sure. No need for promises, they were already living them. By late August, the barn roof needed replacing. Archer climbed the ladder with Ellie steadying the base, while Beatrice laid out the cedar shingles in rows. The colt Patience, now fully halter, broke pace the fence nearby, his coat deepening with the season. At dusk, the family gathered under the open sky with plates of cornbread and beans, the air thick with the scent of sage and cut hay. Elsie leaned against Beatrice's side, eyelids heavy with sleep, while Ellie listened to Archer describe the coming winter's plans, adding chickens, fencing the south pasture. After supper, Archer walked Beatrice out past the barn, where the stars blinked low and bright. "I've been thinking," he said, "about carving a new sign for the house." She looked up at him. "What would it say?" "Fuller Vaughn. I'd like folks to know who keeps this place standing." She answered with a smile that reached her eyes. "Then carve it." That winter, the snow came soft and slow, and the house stayed warm. Beatrice taught Elsie to piece a quilt from the dyed wool, each square stitched with a story. Archer showed Ellie how to trap for pelts without harm, how to track without wasting steps. In February, they hosted Reverend Markham for supper. He brought canned pears and news from Dry Creek, a new schoolhouse, a general store expanding. He said he'd never seen the Vaughn place so fit and full. "Well," Archer said, gazing across the table, "we've had good hands working it." When spring returned, Beatrice planted sweet peas beneath the porch rail. Archer added a second shelf to the pantry, and Ellie built a chicken coop that held strong through the first windstorm. Patience carried a full load of fence posts without balking. One evening, long after the sun had dipped behind the ridge, Archer and Beatrice stood at the edge of the pasture, hands twined. "You ever miss the road?" he asked. She shook her head. "I've walked too far to want anything but stillness now." He turned to her, voice low. "I never thought I'd have this again, land, children, peace. You gave it back to me." She laid her palm against his chest. "And you gave me something I never had, a place to belong." They kissed beneath the stars, the kind of kiss shaped by firelight and long days and quiet knowing. Around them, the land stretched wide and steady, and the house behind them pulsed with the life they'd built together. Years later, the sign above the porch still bore both their names, weathered but firm. The porch creaked under grown children's boots, and the garden bloomed with sweet peas and squash. Archer's hair had silvered at the temples. Beatrice's hands bore the marks of a life fully lived, sun-darkened, lined, capable. And every evening, when the wind moved through the cottonwoods and the sky turned to gold, they sat side by side on the porch steps, hands clasped, hearts quiet, their love not new anymore but deeper, rooted, and entirely whole.